All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky. I am your host for today's valuable program. On Standing for Truth, we uphold the truth of biblical creation. It is a privilege to have Michael J. Oard with me this evening to assist in accomplishing this important mission. This event is a comprehensive examination of dating methods. If you believe radiometric dating demonstrates that the earth is millions and billions of years old, you might just have your mind changed after watching this program. Mike is going to answer the important questions. Is the earth old? And why ages in millions and billions of years? Mike is an excellent researcher and has blessed this ministry with so many educational presentations. These talks include the rapid formation of caves, the receding floodwaters, the Ice Age. We've done both a technical presentation or program on the Ice Age and a simplified version in order to have the best of both worlds here for our viewers and audience. We've had programs answering challenges and refuting objections. We've had a program on the Green River Formation, the Grand Canyon, the Missoula Flood. And so in a way, we've left no stone unturned. Mike Oard, it's great to have you back, brother. I hope you've been well. The last time you were here was a couple months back for a program, an excellent program on the Ice Age. And so, Mike, tell us, how have you been since then?
Oh, I've been really busy being mostly out of town, but other than that, I'm doing well.
Well, that's good. I appreciate, in light of how busy you are and all the study you do and research and talks out of town that I know you do. I appreciate you giving us your time for these programs.
You're
And so,
welcome.
Mike, we're here on Saying for Truth. We're always getting new viewers, new subscribers. So for anybody who might be unfamiliar with who you are, what I'd like to do is give you a formal introduction, and then we'll get into your presentation. And so Michael has a master's science degree in atmospheric science from the University of Washington and is now retired after working as a meteorologist with the U.S. National Weather Service for 30 years. He has researched and speaks on the compelling evidence for Noah's flood and the ice age that followed, and how the incredible woolly mammoth, another topic that Mike has presented on here, connects to biblical history. Michael has published many papers in his field in widely recognized journals and has written An Ice Age Caused by the Genesis Flood, Ancient Ice Ages or Gigantic Submarine Landslides, the Missoula Flood Controversy, and the Genesis Flood, and the Frozen Record. He is also author of Frozen in Time, which I have behind me, a must-read, must-have book, The Weather Book, and Life in the Great Ice Age. Mike, I also have to give a shout out to one of your newer books that I have behind me to the right for this one, Biblical Geology 101. And so, Mike, you've done an excellent job here with this important information on all things origin. So, Mike, we're going to get right into it. Tonight's
Okay.
topic, examining dating methods. I'll get your slides up here. And brother, the floor is yours.
Okay. Now, my topic this time is about dating methods. Is the Earth billions or thousands of years old? It's a huge contrast with what the secular world says and what the Bible says, as I will show. Anyway, an overview of the talk. First of all, I'm going to establish that the whole issue is important. And I'm going to show how the Bible says it's young. I'm going to go into secular dating methods that say it's old, but that show you a number of problems. And I'm going to reveal to you that there are dating methods indicating the Earth is young. And there's hundreds of claimed slow processes, like the origin of coal, origin of oil, origin of ice ages, etc. But these can be sped up by bringing the flood back into Earth history. So is it important? Well, in this book, The Bible Rocks and Time, Geological Evidences for the Age of the Earth, by Davis Young, retired professor of geology at Calvin College, and the current professor of geology at Calvin College, Ralph Sturley, say this: we have also concluded that the Bible is not concerned about the age of the earth at all. The Bible leaves it up to humans to try to figure it out, how old the earth is, if that is a question that interests us. Well, they kind of downplay it, saying we should be focusing more on the rock of ages and the ages of rocks. However, and these two geologists have already compromised and believe in millions and billions of years. So these are statements we often hear, but it has major effect on Christians. 89% of Christian students attend public school, but 70% who attend church and high school will leave the church after they leave home. 70% will leave. Answers in Genesis sent out a poll to 1,000 evangelicals in their 20s who left the church. They asked them, why did you leave? Well, there were a lot of different answers, but about half did not believe the entire Bible. Most believe the earth is old, and the old days caused about half to doubt the Bible. It starts in early grade school. The millions of years are thrown at you, and unless you check into it deeply, which I would encourage any Christian or even non-Christian to do, you're liable to think it's been well established and proven. So it is important. It's causing especially young people to doubt the Bible and leave Christianity. And the Bible says it young. I'm going to go into that next. And well, the way you determine this is those genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11. Here's a little table of that. Creation is in 6 days. Age of the earth would be 0. And Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. Age of the earth would be 130 years old when Seth was born. And you keep on going, clear down to the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5 until you come to the time of the flood, about 1,656 years. Then you go to Genesis 11 and 12, and you can do the same thing, adding up the genealogies, which are very precise genealogies, and it's doubtful there's any ancestors missing, like a grandfather-grandson relation, as some critics claim. But even if there were such things in there, it only had several hundred or several thousand years at the most. But secular scientists need billions now. And you can keep on going, etc. So the age of the earth at the time of Christ's birth was about 4,000 years. And when this slide was made in 2005, that made the total age of the earth 6,008 years. So that's where we get the young earth. Now the Septuagint has little longer ages for some of the patriarchs, and they add maybe 1,500 more years to creation, but it's not much. I'm not going to get into the difference between the Masoretic and the Septuagint text. I'll leave that for experts in those languages, which I am definitely not. And some people think there's a huge gap between Adam and creation, where you can jam millions and billions of years. But there's quite a few verses in the Bible that indicates you can't really do that. Here's one, Mark 13:19. It says, for those days, he's talking about the last days, will be a time of tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of creation, which God created until now and never will. There have to be people around for tribulation to occur, and they have been around since the beginning of creation, not billions of years after the creation. And Mark 10:6 says, but from the beginning of creation, almost at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So people existed from the beginning. I noticed that God made them male and female. There are only two genders. It's from the Bible. It's obvious, despite what the culture is trying to do. And here's another one. So that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. In other words, blood has been shed since the foundation of the world. In other words, there's no time gap in there. These are the words of Jesus. So Jesus believed in a young earth, and I'm certainly going to believe in a young earth. And 1 Corinthians warns us about the wisdom of the world. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. Is a young earth kind of a foolish statement in front of the wise? Indeed it is. But we can defend it, as I will show. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. So it essentially boils down to, which authority are you going to believe? The infallible Word of God, which despite an army of critics has maintained the test of time, or the fallible opinions of sinful men with their scientific theories? Well, I know what I'm going to do. So it is important. The Bible says young, but secular dating methods say it's old, but they have many problems. Now we need to look at the history of all this. This is a major assumption. The Earth and old dates were assumed clear back to the late 1700s. James Hutton published his Theory of the Earth in 1795, in which he actually kind of formalized uniformitarianism, but people had been using it before Hutton in the late 1700s anyway. And Lyell came around, published Principles of Geology 1830 to 1833, that cemented uniformitarianism in the minds of the culture. But we need to remember one thing about all this. Rocks don't come with dates. What we observe is the rock and the sediment and fossils. It's an interpretation. Science is the rocks and fossils, and they do not come with dates. Dates are interpretations based on whether you trust the secular scientists or the Bible. For instance, when you dig out a bone, it doesn't come with a date stamped on it. You have to infer that. And there's lots of dating methods to try to infer that age. But the real science, based on observations, is the bone and the sediments it's in. But there are some rocks with actual dates. These are the only rocks that have dates on them. Anyway, there are three main dating challenges for creation scientists. Starlight in time, or the speed of light issue, radiometric dating, and slow processes that supposedly take millions of years. Anyway, I'm just going to briefly touch on that first one since I'm not an astronomer. We actually have 5 theories out on how we could see starlight billions of light years out there. We're sophisticated to have 5 theories. But the secular scientists have the same difficulty. How? It's called the horizon problem. Early in the Big Bang, it expands. And we discovered that the temperature of space is the same no matter where you look, 2.7 degrees Kelvin. And in order for that to happen, you have to have radiation going back and forth from all the particles, smoothing out temperature fluctuations to get a homogeneous temperature. And like this right here, as they spread out. This is a bit difficult to grasp, but you'd have to look at more technical publications from some of our creation astronomers to know this, but they have the same problem. And it's called the horizon problem. And they try to solve it by a period of inflation. Well within 1 second, supposedly the universe expanded exponentially. And in the process, light traveled all over, absorbed, re-radiated, and all the temperature anomalies got smoothed out to the uniform temperature. If you read up on this, you'll find out in order for this to happen, the speed of light has to be over 1 million times the current value. So they have the problem too, and so do we. So that's all I'm going to say on that. But let's get into radiometric dating. And it's not like what a lot of you think. Anyway, radioactivity. A lot of atoms, especially if they have too many neutrons, become unstable. They become what's called radioactive. They give out particles and energy. And they change from one element to another element over a certain period of time, which we can measure as a half-life. And here are some of the mechanisms we use. Potassium changes to argon. Argon's a gas, and gases can move a lot, even in the rock. So I think there's been a lot of errors with this potassium argon method. Uranium lead is probably one of the first ones developed. Uranium changes to lead in 18 steps, giving off 8 helium nuclei in the process of changing various elements until they get to lead. And thorium changes to lead, very similar change. Samarium changes to neodymium, rubidium changes to strontium. Those are the main dating methods, and they have a lot of analysis mechanisms, like the isochrone mechanism, to analyze these in more detail. But we need to remember that there are 3 main assumptions in all radiometric dating methods, and each dating method has its own individual assumptions added onto those 3. So the way to think about this, like with the uranium lead mechanism, like the hourglass, you have uranium at the top, and it changes to lead with time. Notice it goes through radium. It also goes through radon, I might add. Both of those, radon is a gas, and it's one of those gases that's leaking up into our basement. We have to mitigate for it. In fact, I'm at the borderline where I have to mitigate. And so I need to look into that in the future. And radium moves around a lot in water. So that's some of the problems. But anyway, when they assume the clock starts when the lava solidifies, and the minerals are supposed to be sealed tightly and in what's called a closed system, meaning you can't add uranium or lead or subtract it. But there's a lot of problems with that, as I'll get into. Also, the uranium will decay with a half-life from a parent to the daughter. The uranium's considered the parent, the lead the daughter. And the time for the half-life is where half of it is gone, like the uranium lead method. It has a half-life of about 4.5 billion years. So it's a exceedingly slow change. This is based on measurements of today's rate. I'm going to emphasize today's rate. That doesn't mean the rate has been the same throughout biblical Earth history. And then another half decays down to where you have a quarter left, and that's a second half-life. Then an eighth, that's a third half-life. 1/16 is a fourth. And those, you can draw a curve on that. So after about 4 half-lives, there's only 1/16 of the uranium left that hasn't changed to lead. So that's generally how it goes. So I told you there's three main assumptions in radiometric dating, and these assumptions are difficult to prove, and secular scientists often use them to reject dates they don't agree with. One I've already hinted at: initial conditions must be known. In other words, you need to know the initial amount of potassium. By the way, that's the radioactive potassium 40 at the beginning, and the amount of argon at the beginning. You got to know the initial amount, the initial uranium, initial lead. Well, you might think that in the system it started with zero daughter products, but that almost never occurs for whatever reason. I'm not quite sure. But because you always have some initial daughter, they have to make further assumptions to determine how much, when you measure it, is from radiometric decay and how much was originally in the rock when it cooled. Also, not only do you need to know the initial elements, you need to the rock needs to be sealed, closed. You can't get any parent going in or out, or any daughter going in and out. How realistic is that over millions of years, especially when water brings a lot of these elements into rocks and takes them out? The third major assumption is they assume is a constant rate of decay for millions and billions of years. So let's kind of look at this with the hourglass. You need to know the starting amount, which you don't know usually. When the rock cools, and you can't gain any uranium or lead or lose uranium or lose lead over millions of years. But water can seep into a rock and it can move those elements out and into another rock. So these are big issues, and the rate has to be the same for millions and billions of years. Anyway, because of their dating methods, they get a lot of wrong dates. And I'm just going to go through a few. Here is in Australia, they had sands and clays above black basalt. But in that black basalt, you had some tree roots in siltstone. Anyway, the sandstone, claystone, and siltstone were dated for 255 million years old. But the basalt below it, which should be older, was dated at 45 million years old. And that covered up some wood, some roots that were carbon-14 dated to 44 to 45,000 years. So how old is all this stuff? Big problem. Oh, by the way, carbon-14 does not date rocks. It only dates carbon. Anything with carbon in it, charcoal, a bone, a tree, organic matter. It only dates carbon, and it has a short half-life of 5,730 years. So after about 10 half-lives to about 60,000 years, you can't hardly detect any carbon-14. I'll have a comment on this soon. Anyway, Dr. Andrew Snelling dated this mountain in northern New Zealand, Mount Ngauruhoe. And it's been erupting in historical times. And here's 5 of them that we know of. And it's produced some real fresh looking lava. There's 2 types of lava, and Paho. Is a rough type that you're seeing there. Paho is more the rope type, which you don't see there. Of course, these are Hawaiian terms, and Hawaii has a lot of basalt lava. Anyway, a thin section shows real sharp looking crystals. 11 samples, 13 measurements. Potassium argon ages range from 0 to 3.5 million years when the lava cooled. Also, in Grand Canyon, you have the Grand Canyon supergroup, tilted Precambrian rocks about 15 degrees to the east. And you have the Cardenas basalt, and you have all these dikes and sills, which are right in here. And they're obviously older than the fresh lava flows, new lava flows from fresh cones on the northwest rim of the canyon, where the lava actually flowed down into the Grand Canyon that was already formed. These are very likely post-flood volcanoes, and actually dammed the Colorado River up for a short while. Anyway, by the same method, which is considered one of the best, rubidium strontium isochrome, the Cardenas basalt at the bottom of the Grand Canyon was dated 1.07 billion years old. But by the same method, the lava at the top of Grand Canyon was dated 1.34 billion years old by the same dating methods. So something's wrong somewhere. Anyway, we have a lot of these. Now I'm going to get into carbon-14. I actually gave you a little hint of this already. Carbon-14 is our friend. It has a maximum where they did 50 to 55,000 years that they date with. And we could use it as a relative time scale, not the absolute dates. Anyway, it dates carbon, not rocks. As I said, it has a half-life of 57-30 years. Now, after 80,000 years, what is that in half-life? Maybe about 14 or 15. Our instruments can't detect any more carbon-14, which means that if carbon-14 is detected, the carbon is less than 80,000 years. Notice I emphasize less. Doesn't mean it's 80,000 years, it means less than. So, the RATE project that was sponsored by the Institute of Creation Research and the Creation Research Society, one project was to date coal. And we dated coal by carbon-14, since coal is pure carbon. It's squished plant and trees, pre-flood trees that were covered up by the flood and turned to coal. And coal could form rapidly, by the way. Anyway, the secular scientists date coal anywhere from 15 to 350 million years. But guess what? We found carbon-14 in all coal samples. The secular scientists have done the exact same thing. So probably well over 100 samples of coal have been dated by carbon-14, meaning the coal is less than 80,000 years. But the secular scientists always claim contamination. Hundreds of times, over 100 times. I mean, if a person is taking a sample, he tries very hard to avoid contamination. And he's not going to pick a coal sample that, say, has a crack in it where you can get young carbon from the surface that seeps down and is absorbed there, supposedly. No, but we decided to humor them. We decided to date diamonds. Diamonds are pure carbon, and so therefore you can use the carbon-14 method to date diamonds. So Dr. John Baumgartner and his team did this, not only the coal, but the diamonds. Now, the age is based on the half-life of potassium argon. The diamonds 1.2 billion years, supposedly. And that's how old they think diamonds are. But guess what? We carbon-14 dated 12 diamonds and got an age of 58,000 years. Meaning diamonds are no way near billions of years old. And carbon-14 gave 58,000 years, much, much younger. And we can treat the carbon-14 dating method in a relative time scale. In general creation, scientists think it's accurate out to 3,000 years. But between 3,000 years ago in the biblical time scale to the end of the flood, 4,500 years ago, we believe we can telescope all those carbon-14 dates from 3,000 to 55,000 years to within that 1,500 years after the flood. For the reason, we're not quite sure what the reason is. So the big question, why do rocks still give dates of millions and billions of years? Why do the radiometric dates come out that far? Well, Dr. Russell Humphreys did a project on granite in a New Mexico core and that drilled deep. It was pretty hot in that area. And so you'll see the black minerals there. Most of those are black mica or biotite. And biotite could be highly radioactive because it has zircon crystals. So he dated the zircon crystals by the uranium lead method. Anyway, the zircon crystals are pretty small. And you find them in the granite. They contain a lot of uranium and thorium. They're highly radioactive. And by the uranium lead method, uranium thorium changing to lead with time, you can date. And as you change from uranium down to lead, you give off 8 helium nuclei that grab electrons from the environment and become 8 helium atoms. And helium is a noble gas and does not bond with anything. It can move around in the lattice of the zircon crystal. And those helium atoms that are moving through the crystal that come too close to the edge will leak out. So based on the leak rate of the zircon crystals, you have another dating method, uranium helium. And so Humphreys and Baumgartner presented this at the ICC, the International Conference on Creationism, this result. By the uranium lead method, the age is 1.5 billion years. In other words, you had 1.5 billion years of change at present rates in the zircon crystals. But giving off helium, you had way too much helium in these zircon crystals. In fact, about 1 million times too much. So, and then they had the leak rate of helium out of the zircon crystals, out of the biotite and granite. They had the leak rate or the diffusion measured by a secular lab. And based on the amount of helium left, it gave an age of 5,680 years, plus or minus 2,000. Pretty close to the date from the Bible. So which dating method is correct? And how do you reconcile this? Well, the leak rate is a very physical mechanism, well understood. Diffusion is well understood. But uranium changing to lead, don't quite understand how this all works. The way to reconcile it is to go with the uranium-helium age of 6,000 years. But in that time, you had 1.5 billion years of radiometric decay. In other words, we had accelerated radiometric decay sometime in the Earth's history. When exactly is being worked on. Some think as during creation week, some during the flood, some both. So we really don't know. So anyway, this has been presented at secular meetings by Russell Humphreys. And over the years, secular scientists have tried hard to dispute this. they can't take it at face value. It's a very solid result. And because of their worldview of millions of years and uniformitarianism and probably naturalism and evolution, they can't accept it. So they have to find a reason why it's wrong. Anyway, Humphreys has defended all this. First of all, the biotite does not impede helium diffusion. There's a rate and you can measure. But then the zircons contain too much helium. And actually, this is a summary of the results that I've already given you. The only solution is accelerate radiometric decay sometime in the past. And this indicates that radiometric dates are wrong. We could probably use them in a relative sense. For instance, a date of 5 million years old would be considered pretty young. Well, a date of, say, 1 billion years, we could say that's probably from the Precambrian and is older. So we can use these probably in a relative sense, but I wouldn't want to be absolute about this, saying that a date of 10 million years is older than a date 5 million years on a relative time scale. It's too fine. It's too close together. Slight differences can change this radically. I have a personal reason why I've been always skeptical of millions of years, besides trusting the Bible. You know, we scientists think we know so much. I was a weather forecaster for 30 years, and being a weather forecaster prepares you to be a creation scientist, I might add, to not take yourself too seriously, to realize you can be wrong, and to realize that all these absolute pronouncements of this being millions and billions of years old have to be taken with a grain of salt. For instance, I did this. Today's weather forecast is 100% chance of sunshine. I probably ruined thousands of outdoor activities. That's why I'm skeptical about the ability to be accurate of life on Earth millions of years ago. So I showed that was important. We're losing the youth because of the school system, the bombardments of millions of years. The Bible says that's young. Secular dating methods say old, but they have many problems. And we can explain the millions and billions of years. And would you know there are dating methods that indicate the Earth is young? There's actually quite a few of these, dozens of them. One of them is the amount of salt that's going into the ocean. I believe Dr. Steve Austin did this calculation. We know how much salt is entering the oceans from the continents and how much is leaving. So you just subtract the difference and divide that into the volume of salt, and you get a minimum age, which means the sea is less than 62 million years old. Remember, that's the minimum. But if you bring the flood into Earth history, the flood would have added a lot of that salt. So the ocean is much, much less than 62 million years because of the flood adding salt. Comets. There are short and long period comets. A short period goes around the sun in ellipse and back out to Jupiter. And we have a few hundred of the short period comets. But a comet is a dirty snowball, not very large. And every time it goes around the sun, it loses matter. That tail you see there is losing matter going around the sun. So obviously they're not going to keep going around for a long time before they're totally gone. People have given various maximum estimates of how old the solar system can be would be in the future before all short period comets disappear. I've seen figures from 10 to 50,000 years. In other words, we'll say within 50,000 years, all short period comets should be gone. And the fact that we still have several hundred means that the solar system is young. But secular scientists dispute this, saying that there's a source of short period comets out in the beyond the solar system that periodically add comets. But guess what? We've never seen this so-called Oort cloud of comets, nor would we seen short period comets coming into the solar system. And getting that elliptical orbit is a very fine-tuned orbit. And to have that happen is too precise. But we haven't observed it. But we have observed short period comets being destroyed. Comet Hale-Bopp hit Jupiter in, I think, 1994. Before it got there, it broke into pieces and slammed into Jupiter. So we observed that being destroyed. Also, we've seen in telescope where they split apart and are destroyed. Many of the meteor showers we have over the years is the Earth passing through the tail of disintegrated comets. So comets are being destroyed, none are being added. The actual data indicates the solar system is very young, within several tens of thousands of years at the most. Pretty solid indication. Here's kind of a more diagram. So it is important because we're using the Luth. The Bible says it's young, and secular dating methods always come out old, but they have many, many problems and assumptions. And there are dating methods indicating Earth is young. Now, there's a lot of claimed slow processes. When you bring the flood back into our thinking, these processes speed up, and we can explain them. I've worked on this sort of things for over 50 years. Here's a few claimed slow processes: ice ages, coal and oil, thick sediments, caves. I'm working on caves right now. The origin of the cave opening, and then the addition of all the nice stalactites and stalagmites and columns. This can all happen due to from the flood and the unique conditions of the early post-flood ice age, as I will show in a future book. But I'm just going to, and there's many more I might add. And I've worked on many of these, and I do find answers within the biblical timescale. You need to first of all examine the raw data. And when I do that, from the observations, much observations I can, I first of all find out that often such features are challenges to the uniformitarian timescale. For instance, the origin of limestones or the origin of chalk by slow processes of chalk formation that we measure today. But the chalk is too pure to be that slow. Big problem. Coal is too pure to have accumulated over tens of thousands to millions of years. So they have their problems in explaining it. But I'm going to only focus on thick sediments. The best road cut, I mean, as an amateur geologist, I love to look at road cuts. The best road cut in the world is the slice through Grand Canyon. You see sedimentary rocks spread out over 200 miles. And you see various features here. You see they could trace most of these layers throughout the whole canyon, 200 miles. And one formation at the bottom, the Tapete Sandstone, you can trace over half of North America. Now, in uniformitarianism, it claims to explain all this by terrestrial environments, shallow seas, and so forth, all this deposition. But in uniformitarianism, they depend on present processes we see going on today. What kind of present processes of deposition do we see today? Well, river floods depositing sediment along the floodplain or into a delta out in the ocean or a lake. Also, a hurricane will come and churn up sediments and move them and spread, say, sand over maybe 1,000 square kilometers at the most. Regardless, the change in the type of sediment is small. And then it changes to some other sediment horizontally or vertically, quickly. So you should see small scale sediment packages. But we don't see that in the sedimentary rocks at all. And the Grand Canyon is not an exception, it's typical. We could trace some of those layers thousands of miles, like the bottom Tepete sandstone right there. And that's what it looks like. It's a unique, the bottom of the Grand Canyon. It's unique, has small cross beds, coarse grain. You can even see some of the pebbles of quartz, probably from the disintegration of granite. And that's, you can trace it most of the time under the ground, underneath sediments over half of North America. You can find it clear to the Appalachians. Up in my area of Montana and Wyoming, you can trace it. It has a unique position. It's on top of the upper crustal rocks, granites and metamorphic rocks. So it's so unique you can't miss it in boreholes. And it's called the Flathead Sandstone in my area. Secular scientists do not realize that these sands are connected. So they give them different names in different states. And this sand can be traced up through the Canadian Rockies and up into Northeast Canada, like I said, covering about half of North America. And it's about 100 to 300 feet thick and very few shale beds. So you can't miss it. Now I asked the viewer, what kind of uniformitarian processes would do this? Obviously, there aren't any. This is what we'd expect in the flood, where sediment was deposited over wide areas and quickly with one layer laid upon another. And getting back to that, when you see the Grand Canyon, you see one layer flat on another with little or no erosion between layers or within layers, indicating the sediments were laid quickly one on another. Secular scientists say the horizontal sediments in the Grand Canyon, 4,000 feet thick worth, were deposited over 250 million years. Well, erosion on a million-year timescale is so fast that you should see canyons and valleys through the walls of the Grand Canyon from the erosion over 1 million years. So not only that we could trace these layers long distance, but the fact that there's little or no erosion over millions of years screams flood. The sediments scream there was a flood to deposit the sedimentary rocks. Sediments and then cemented to sedimentary rocks. Not uniformitarianism. It defies uniformitarianism. To gel this concept better, I'm at the top of Rendezvous Mountain in the southern Teton Mountains, looking north. You can see the tip of Grand Teton in the very center of the picture, but to the south of the Grand Tetons, which are igneous granite and metamorphic rocks, mainly gneiss, which is kind of like a banded granite. On the north and south, you have sedimentary rocks that used to be on where the Grand Tetons now are. In other words, you had a slab of granite, you had maybe about 2 miles of sedimentary rocks on it, and the Grand Tetons rose like this. This is via a north-south direction. In the center, all the sediments were eroded off, leaving those sharp Grand Teton Mountains, but on the north and south limbs, sedimentary rocks were not washed off. So you can see what's there. And you see up here in the southern Tetons, the bottom similar to the bottom 2/3 of Grand Canyon, dated about a little less than 200 million years, they say. And they're flat, one on top of another, with the flathead sandstone being the bottom one, equivalent to the tapetes. And 3 secular scientists analyzed the Teton Mountains and the valley to the east called Jackson Hole. And this is what they said. The regularity and parallelism of the layers in well-exposed sections, which I showed you a picture of, suggests that all these rocks were deposited in a single uninterrupted sequence. That's what your eyes tell you. That's the observation. And we have a mechanism to account for that called the flood. But do they believe their eyes? However, the fossils and regional distributions of the rock units show that this is not really the case. The incomplete nature of the stratigraphic record becomes apparent when the spans of time represented by each of the various formations are plotted on a numerical time scale. And that's the numerical time scale. You can see the time scale on the left, but there's 500 million up to a little below 300 million. And those are the formations that they have are in the blue. And the bottom is the flathead sandstone. They have one formation not seen in the Grand Canyon called the Bighorn Dolomite. But the other ones corresponds. Madison limestone is similar to the Red Wall limestone. Notice the white here. That's gaps in time. One of those gaps is 80 million years. Well, where's all the erosion in 80 million years? It's not there. Not only are there gaps, major gaps between formations, within a formation, there are gaps. I mean, this looks like the Bighorn Dolomite was deposited in 10 million years. But no, it was there's gaps all through that Bighorn Dolomite. In fact, some secular scientists have said that we only have about 1% of the sedimentary record in all those millions of years. It's full of gaps and no erosion between layers and within layers. Again, showing those millions of years do not exist. In summary, it is important because we are losing the young people, and it determines whether we can trust the whole Bible. The genealogies and words of Jesus indicate a young earth. Numerous problems and assumptions associated with radiometric dating. We can explain the millions and billions of years by accelerated radiometric decay. Numerous processes indicate a much younger Earth than secular scientists say, such as the decay of short period comets. And there's much evidence for rapid sedimentation when we bring the flood back to Earth history. Claim flow processes can be accelerated during the flood and after the flood for the Ice Age. And I wrote a book on all this. Now, I was at a conference of pastors, and one pastor came up to me and said, I want to learn about radiometric dating, but all those books you have are too complicated. We have some really complicated books, like the 2 rate books. And we have a couple more that are more layman friendly, but even those are too complicated. So I attempted to write a book for a layman with no science background. And this is what I came up, the deep time deception, examining, it has a subtitle that you don't see there, examining the case for millions of years. So that's the end of my talk, and I hope you were edified and realize that we don't have to believe those millions of years. We can still trust the Bible. And I want to leave you with this truth. Your faith should not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. Evolution, millions of years, is trying to explain everything without God. Our faith should not rest on man's wisdom, but God has the power to create and create a young earth. And here's some websites. My final slide. I have a website with 2 free ebooks on it, michael.ords.net. Anyway, I thank you for listening.
Mike, excellent presentation, as always. And yes, I was edified. I know the audience was edified. In the audience, we've had a good mix of critics and non-critics.
Okay.
And so hopefully we've planted some seeds, and we can also do our best here to address many of these challenges or objections that have come in, and also questions of clarification. And so, Mike, I can put most of these questions up on the screen for you to see visually.
Okay.
But in order for you to see them, you might have to press escape on your PowerPoint there and
get out of share screen.
Yeah, and make your way back to
okay.
StreamYard. I like what you did with your book, The Deep Time Deception, because we do have, in the world of young Earth creation, Mike, as you pointed out, we have a lot of technical material that includes papers, that includes books, but it's also good that we can take the technical arguments, the technical material, and also convey it to the layperson, to the everyday person. And you've done a good job with that. And I think this presentation was a good example of that as well. You provided many good pieces of evidence. I'd like to ask you, because I find the evidence from radiocarbon, carbon-14, to be very compelling.
Yes, I do too.
In the years that I've been doing this, I remain unpersuaded or unconvinced by the responses that I've seen from skeptics, Mike, to the C14 found in diamonds and the coal that you talked about.
Yeah.
Especially with diamonds. I mean, the hardest substance on Earth should be immune in many ways to contamination.
Yes.
The C14 should be intrinsic. I'm curious, Mike, what would we as creationists do to the C14 then that we do find in diamonds? Is that original created C14, do you think? Because if it's there and it shouldn't be there, if the Earth is millions to billions of years old, how did it get there?
That's a good question. I probably lean that it was created there, but to be honest, I haven't thought about it much. I just focused in on the contradiction between secular ideas and creation scientist idea. Coal is be a little different. I belong to a global community where we gather maybe every 2 or 3 months to try to refine the carbon-14 method. And we have more questions than answers when you get beyond 3,000 years. And there's questions about how much carbon-14 collected pre-flood. And did the carbon-14 start at zero at the end of the flood? There's some questions on all this. And what would cause the rapid increase in carbon-14 for the first 1,500 years after the flood? We actually have 2 ideas on that. Russell Humphreys has one on cosmic rays from the sun increasing carbon-14 production at the upper atmosphere. That's how they're formed, by cosmic rays. I have an idea that they're cosmic rays in general from the outside the solar system. So regardless, we think cosmic rays greatly increased during and after the flood. And so those are some ideas thrown out. And I think there's 1 or 2 ideas I can't think of right now, but we're working on it. Research is exceedingly slow.
Yeah, well, and there's endless research projects, which means if you're a biblical creationist, you'll never be bored.
Never, never bored.
There really is endless things to study and research. And so I like that you pointed that out with the C14 and how C14 is created in the upper atmosphere through cosmic ray bombardment. Okay, so going back in the past, can we look to carbon dating as something being reliable, maybe going back a couple thousand years, a few thousand years, but the closer we get to the flood, and then obviously the closer we get to the pre-flood world, where the magnetic field would have been different, the nature of the atmosphere would have been different. Is this where carbon dating becomes more unreliable then, Mike?
Yes. After the flood, there probably wasn't too much carbon-14 in the atmosphere. Then there was a great increase in carbon-14. So like when you date a mammoth and you don't find much carbon-14 in it, well, it's because it lived soon after the flood. And other organisms that maybe lived 1,000 years have gathered a lot of carbon-14, and so they would date much younger. So that's generally what we think, and but we got to figure out why the carbon-14 increased so fast after the flood. It probably even started during the flood too. So that's what we're working on, and so
it's an important question, and it's an objection that frequently comes up. And so I'm glad we're talking about it here. Is a challenge from our chat. Sydney Raptor, appreciate the question. And so he brings up this issue. This is a common one, as when we'll point out the contradiction in the old Earth model, as you've done. We find C14 in coal and dinosaur fossils and diamonds. C14 has such a short half-life. Is it true or accurate to say, Mike, that if every atom in the universe was radiocarbon, it would have all decayed easily in 500,000 to 1,000,000 years?
Oh, well, yeah, it'd probably be 100,000 years.
Wow. Okay, so we should not find the levels of C14 that we do find, but here's their response. In my opinion, they're not really refuting the data that strongly contradicts their millions to billions of years model, but they'll say, okay, well, the dates that they got, the rate team got in coal, in diamonds, so on and so forth, is in the tens of thousands of years. Yes. Firstly, they'll say that's more than 6,000 years. So it contradicts our model according to them. We've largely addressed the unreliability of C14 dating the closer, the more we move back in time. But they'll also say that, well, we get a consistent age. Here it looks like Sydney Raptor is saying about 70,000 years. And they'll say that consistency, I think, this is the way I'm interpreting it, means that this could be background or simply contamination that's being detected. What are your thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, I don't think the diamonds are contaminated. I don't think the coal is contaminated either. So I believe we can rule out that. And the secular scientists, the reason they date coal is for background for their machines. That to start at some level that's not zero. The reason we get these older dates in diamonds and coal, 58,000 years for diamonds, is because there's hardly any carbon-14 in these systems. So by the method, it would, of course, date very old because of the lack. So is this due to lack of cosmic rays forming carbon-14 in the pre-flood world? Yeah, or very small amount. So, but it's kind of consistent in that during the flood, we would be bearing carbon. We wouldn't expect much carbon-14 in there. So anything you date that was buried in the flood, like coal, should be near zero. So you'd get, say, 70,000 years out of it. The practical limit of carbon-14 today is 50 to 55,000 years Beyond that, it's the contamination's more of a problem. But the machines can detect clear past 70,000 years. But beyond that, they lose it. So I think I hopefully answered that question that I see before me from Sydney.
Don't we find a consistency in the amount of C14 that we find in coal that correlates with this coal being formed during the flood, Mike?
I forgot what the great scientist found. I don't remember how consistent. All I remember, it was quite low,
Mm-hmm.
and gave, of course, old ages when you don't have a lot of carbon-14 in the coal. But I don't remember whether it grouped around a particular age. I kind of think that it did.
Yeah, if maybe I've got a slide on this actually. Let me see here. We had Dr. John Baumgartner on recently for a seminar, excellent seminar on the flood. We also had a section on this issue. And if you can see this visual, I wonder if you could help me explain to the audience the significance of some of this. These are from Dr. John Baumgartner's slides. When it comes to we got diamonds here and then 10 coal samples and the C14 age in years.
You're pretty close.
Yeah. All very close.
About 50,000 years on the average.
Now, I think that's an interesting point. And I'm wondering, what is the significance of this, for example? So rate C14 measurements of 6 African diamonds. So we find C14 in all of these diamonds where we shouldn't find it. But when it says results are between 40 times and 310 times the AMS detection limit, what is the significance of that, Mike?
Oh, that means, you had that much more carbon-14 that you can detect. That's beyond no detection. So that means it's there's enough carbon-14 to be easily detected by our current machines in coal and diamonds. And the fact that the coal is so close, you kind of expect that in the pre-flood biosphere, the material to have generally the same carbon-14 amount in them, right, which is very low. The reason for very low, we really don't know, but we kind of expect that the Earth would be still pretty young. And maybe it was shielded from carbon-14. So we would expect the vegetation in general that formed coal would generally have the same day. So that makes sense within the flood model.
And here, when it comes to the secular radiocarbon literature, there's a number of different samples. And this isn't just a one-off occurrence or an anomaly. I mean, we have many examples. There's marble, shell, wood, calcite, so on and so forth. It says C14 value for just under 50,000 year corresponds to 1,270 times the AMS detection limit.
Yeah, that's right.
So is that a point against the argument that says that this all might be due to contamination, whether instrumental or environment, Mike?
I don't think so, because the measurements you get, in this case 40,000 about, that's well above the detection limit. That's all it's saying. If you go out to 80,000 years, it'd be about zero. You wouldn't get a detection limit because you can't detect any. But 40,000 years is much greater than the zero limit. And if you got to 30,000 years, it'd probably be 3,000 times as much carbon-14 as the detection limit. So, I don't know if that's saying anything about contamination or what. So it's anyway. That's my analysis of that.
And you remain unconvinced by the arguments from contamination because they're still pretty prominent from anti-creationists. Oh, this is either environmental contamination in the. I guess when it comes to the instruments themselves, I mean, from my understanding, the samples are treated with harsh acids, multiple washes in harsh acids, where the C14 should be intrinsic, shouldn't it, Mike?
I don't quite know what you mean by intrinsic, but it should for coal and diamonds, it would have got there during the formation, and contamination would have been by young carbon from how else a crack coming down from the surface and adding young carbon. That's the only way I could think is contaminated. But when they take samples, they know about contamination, and people who take samples try very hard to guard against contamination.
Right.
And the fact that we have us and the secular scientists have dated coal over 100 times, I don't know the exact number, probably maybe it's in the hundreds. The fact that would think that it can't all be due to contamination. In fact, I believe that hardly any of it is due to contamination.
Right.
And when we date diamonds, we don't believe they can be contaminated at all. So this is a very solid argument, and it defies the millions of years. And because of that, and because conventional scientists are so married to deep time, they got to try to refute it to keep their worldview intact.
Right. I think Dr. Baumgartner, he made a good point when he was presenting on this and we were discussing. He said, at this point, the evidence is so strong, especially in samples like coal, for the presence of C14 where it shouldn't be, and contamination just simply doesn't work as a good rescue device, that to reject this and the implications is more so on a philosophical basis, because they need to hold on to their old earth paradigm. The clear conclusions that we've made based on this evidence would just completely overturn their worldview. And so it doesn't seem like it's a scientific reason really that they're rejecting it.
Yes, it's a non-scientific reason, and for scientists or even for the lay public, I think this is problematic. This is no way to find truth. They should be open to biblical truth.
Amen. Well said. Okay, let's move on to, we'll deal with this one briefly. I do have a couple references I can throw people. As usual with dating methods, when we show the contradictions, why the methods don't work, why we can date rocks of known age and get millions of years, even though they were just formed. So we as creationists like to ask the question, why should we trust dates derived from rocks of unknown age if we can't even get accurate dates of rocks of known age? They'll say, well, we've got isochron dating and it removes assumptions, and we can rely on isochron dating. But before you give your thoughts on that, I checked with the conventional literature. I read up on it through some articles in Dr. Andrew Snelling, but even the secular literature says this, Mike: isochron dating can be challenged by demonstrating scenarios where mixing of materials and altered initial isotopic ratios can lead to misleading results, even if the decay rates are assumed to be constant. While isochron plots are typically linear, indicating a closed system and consistent age, the presence of mixing or alteration can produce a linear plot, but with an incorrect age interpretation. So even in the conventional literature, they're not saying that this is some flawless methodology, Mike.
Yes, I realize the isochrone method is considered very good by them. I can't really tell you much about the details of that. Andrew Snelling is the one to talk about, since he's our top expert on dating methods, and he's gone into isochrone methods a lot deeper than I have. But that's my understanding, is that they can be wrong also, and especially mixing can form that nice straight line that that throws the whole thing off.
Yes, and I would refer people to Andrew Snelling as well as you have. Here's a good article people can look at. It's long, it's detailed, it's comprehensive. Key flaw found in radioisotope isochron dating. You can also find discordant dates. I'm by no means an expert on it, but I've seen discordant dates in the conventional literature as well. So, okay, let's move to this question. This is a common objection here. Let's see. Andrew Cumming. So this was a question or challenge that came in near the end of your presentation when you got into sedimentary rock and the evidence for worldwide flood. So his challenge is this: widespread rock layers doesn't demonstrate a global flood. Many depositional environments today are spread out across large geographic reach. So is he kind of saying, well, okay, we do have sedimentary rock layers that extend over entire continents and even further, and a lot of these layers had to be laid down catastrophically, but hey, this wasn't all in a single year. This could easily have occurred regionally. So local catastrophes over lots of time rather than one worldwide catastrophe in a short amount of time.
I think that's what he's saying. He's trying to say that depositional systems today are spread out across a large geographic area. I beg to differ with that, first of all. I would say most of them are local. And at present processes, like the main present process, I think they would deposit sediment over a decently large area, be a hurricane spreading sand. But even in these processes, the sand can change to silt rapidly, or when you talk about stream erosion and all that, you have conglomerate sand. You have changes in what's called facies, different types of sediment, horizontally and vertically. So I don't think you can find depositional environments that are spread out like that today, that we know were deposited today or within historical times. I'd like him to name me some, and I will think about them. But the fact that the layers of sedimentary rocks can commonly be traced well over 100 miles defies uniformitarianism. So I would say that it would demonstrate a global flood, because that's the only way we can spread a layer over a huge area quickly, is by flood deposition on a continental scale. So unless it gives me some examples, it's hard for me to sink my teeth into this. Do you have any examples, Andrew, of large-scale sedimentation we've observed today?
He does look like, so he said not local floods. So I misinterpreted that part. Apologies, Andrew. I like what you said, Mike. Flood deposition on a continental scale. But he says for us to look at the Persian Gulf, the Russian floodplains today, and the Bahamas.
Okay. The carbonate in the Bahamas is probably from the flood, and just the top is just being reworked. Russian floodplain sediment, what are those? I don't know. And I don't know what he means by the Persian Gulf. What sort of sedimentation processes are you referring to in the Persian Gulf and the Russian floodplain? Are you talking about a delta in Russian floodplain? Or no, it'd be, I don't know quite what he says, but regardless, I bet you it's all a pretty small scale.
Right. Yeah, he'd have to give a little more details on
Yeah.
on that one.
Details, Andrew.
Okay, well, so you've discussed this many times on this channel. You've given an entire series of presentations. I actually have on my website, standfortruthministries.com, a section called Flood Boundaries. People can click it and find all of the material. So as creationists, we'll oftentimes say, the fossil record, the rock strata is largely the result of the flood, the worldwide flood, this massive worldwide catastrophic event. But then at the same time, we have to acknowledge catastrophic events, but localized post-flood. And so what is an easy way, if somebody was new to this, Mike, and they wanted a good answer to how can we differentiate between rocks formed during the flood and then geologic features that were formed post-flood, more local versus worldwide?
Okay. Tim Clary and I have developed 35 geological and geomorphological and climate reasons why you have a high post-flood upper flood boundary. So you can using these criteria, you can determine whether a feature is flood or post-flood. So one of the features is the cementation of sedimentary rocks. Based on cementation, which I and Peter Kleberg of Great Falls, Montana have studied, it takes quite a bit of overburden to cement sediments. We thought we had a research project on this, and we were hoping to use it as an estimate of overburden by analyzing the sandstone, but there's too many other processes that interfere. But regardless, to cement sediment, you have to have generally thousands of feet of overburden. And if it's on the surface, it's been eroded off. So cementation is what you'd expect in the flood, because a lot of that overburden was eroded off. We've estimated from our flood sediment research project, an average of 1,900 meters were eroded off during the recessional stage of the flood. So the sediment was there. And so that's the reason why most of the rocks on the surface are hard rock. That's a flood signature. But when you look at post-flood features, this sediment is hardly ever solidified into rock. I'm thinking of Ice Age debris. It's very rare to have cementation going on today. It will occur in local small areas in spots, but it's very local. So based on that, I would conclude that there weren't any huge catastrophes after the flood. The only catastrophe, if you can call it that, would be the Ice Age. And so there's other indications of where the boundary is and where you can tell what is flood and what is post-flood. The coal, there's a lot of coal in the Cenozoic. And coal, to form coal, that's obviously a flood burial process, not post-flood. So that and to form coal, you got to have a lot of overburden to heat it up, depending on the rank of coal. For bituminous coal, like we have in the Powder River Basin, Montana, it depends on the particular rank, and it can have to cement To form coal, the overburden for bituminous would range from about 1.5 to 6 kilometers. And if this coal is at the surface, like you find at the Wyodak coal seam in the Powder River Basin, it means that something like 3 kilometers of sediment was deposited, then eroded off. All that's a big flood signature. And so coal tells us that we have a high flood post-flood boundary. And we have many others between Clary and I that demonstrate, I think, to a strong degree that the boundary of the flood is high up. And therefore, you don't really have any really huge catastrophes like you had in the flood. I hope that answered that question. And there's a lot more I can say. And people can check out my program I did with here on that very subject.
That was an excellent answer. It was exactly what I was looking for, Mike. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Sydney Raptor is asking this. Can Mike please explain the fact that just the Grand Canyon clearly, and that's another topic you've presented on thoroughly, clearly displays marine lacustrine, I probably said that one wrong.
Yeah.
Fluvian and aeolian layers interbedded with each other, different environments. So is he implying that these are layers formed over time in different environments rather than in a short amount of time because of the flood?
Okay. Yeah, there's several shallow marine layers, and the Coconino sandstone is believed to be aeolian, but Whitmore and others have shown that this is absolutely false. It's was claimed to be aeolian, as well as many other sandstone formations in the West United States, because a poor analysis. There's minerals in it like mica and feldspar that in a desert environment, windblown, would decay so really rapidly, so implying rapid deposition. Often the crossbeds are not at the angle of repose, which is 33 degrees approximately. So I don't think these layers are interbedded with each other. They're laid one on top of another, and they would imply different environments of deposition. We believe the so-called aeolian layers are marine. And by the way, when you go to other states, the Coconino sandstone, which you can trace into Kansas and Texas, it actually becomes marine in New Mexico. So I believe these are all separated vertically. And that brings up another thing, paleoenvironmental deductions. When they look at the sediments and the fossils, they make these paleoenvironmental deductions. And in the flood, most of these would not apply. Like if you see a terrestrial fossil, it doesn't mean it's a terrestrial environment, because the flood buried terrestrial organisms. So I'm not sure I answered that question right, but the various layers in Grand Canyon are given different environments, of course, but in a flood, they really wouldn't apply, except they'd be all marine. And I don't think there's any fluvial deposits in the Grand Canyon sediments that I know of. And lacustrine, possibly the Hermit Shale. Anyway, they're separated vertically, but they don't change horizontally into different environments. I mean, if you want to use that term environment, which I don't think you can in a flood context. It's a totally uniformitarian context applied to sediments. For instance, if they see a rounded rock, they automatically think, well, it's a fluvial environment because water rounds rocks, or a beach. But the flood can round rocks really easy. And so a round rock wouldn't imply a certain environment in a flood model. So it's paleo-environmental interpretations are mostly would be inaccurate in the flood. I hope I answered that question.
Well, I think that was a good detailed answer. Do we, Mike, as creationists, have a challenge with the occurrence of certain plants? Like, for example, the secular community will say that flowering plants, these angiosperms, would have first appeared in the fossil record. I think it's in the Cretaceous period.
Yes.
And so they'll look to an ordering, not only in animals and creatures trying to say evolution, but also the evolution of plants. Is that a challenge where these plants show up and how they're sorted in the rock record for creationists?
Yes. I might add that diatoms are also don't show up until I think the middle Mesozoic, but foraminifera, they're found throughout the geological column, and why that's the case, I don't know. We would say ecological zonation, and it was burial by environment. And during the flood, some areas were higher and weren't eroded till later, and this possibly could explain the flowering plants being found in the Cretaceous up into the Cenozoic. But there are a few precursors in the Jurassic, and I think they found amber that's, I forgot, below the Jurassic that they believe came from a flowering plant, but that was disputed, of course, because they said flowering plants hadn't evolved yet. But we would simply explain the order of the fossil record. That's what all this is about, by deposition from different environments. But we need a lot of work on that. So, yes, it is a challenge.
So is it then a preliminary response that flowering plants would have been created and placed by God at higher elevations, along with more of the common mammals that we're familiar with? And
yeah,
so
I would lean like that, but that's a vertical zonation. But I think there's probably also a horizontal zonation that people don't think about. I would lean that way, but we have a lot of detail. Our main problem is we don't know what the pre-flood continents were like,
right,
and how the flood destroyed various ecosystems systematically and buried them. It's going to depend on the pre-flood continents, how high the mountains were, how much of it was a refuge to plants and animals, things like this, and we don't have these answers, and so it's hard to address that except for burial by environments because of ecological vertical zonation and horizontal zonation.
So what you're saying is, if we consider both not only vertical ecological zonation but horizontal zonation, that helps to answer, I'm not saying all of them, but several of these. It's more of a multifaceted or multi-dimensional answer rather than just one or the other.
Yes, I think especially trees. I think your Paleozoic trees, the lycopods and all those, that was probably one environment in certain areas. We don't know where, but horizontally you have your normal trees that we see today buried in the Cenozoic, and they could have been in different environments on a horizontal scale, and and weren't mixed, and they're buried by in a vertical order with the Paleozoic first, and most times that they're separated. You have the Paleozoic and the Cenozoic, and they're usually separated horizontally. So that's a possibility. Anyway, I'm just throwing out ideas because we really don't have enough information to provide a really good answer.
Well, the real estate was completely rearranged at the flood.
Yes.
And a lot of these creatures and environments, if I understood what you're saying earlier, they're transported from their original location.
Yes.
So we would have to somehow backtrack, trace back, rewind the tape of the story of the flood and recreate these environments and the way the continents look like.
Yeah.
Because I think it would be a false assumption to look at the way ecosystems and environments are today and then assume that's how it was in the pre-flood world.
Right.
Because I hear critics, evolutionists, they'll say, okay, if ecological zonation is part of the answer, why don't we find water creatures all buried together, like mosasaur with a whale, or a plesiosaur with a whale, or sharks with whales? I mean, sharks and whales live today, so obviously they've lived together. Or the coelacanth, according to them, the coelacanth went extinct for millions of years, but here it is swimming today. So even though we don't find coelacanth mixed in the same layers with whales, we know they existed because they exist today together. But I'm curious as to your thoughts. If a critic were to say that, well, why don't we find then these water creatures in these water ecosystems? How come we don't find some of them buried together? Plesiosaur and let's say a whale.
Well, I would go along with a horizontal zonation on that. They lived in different areas of the globe.
Yeah.
That'd be my first guess, but that's, I don't know if there'd be a vertical zonation. I'd kind of doubt it. I think it'd be a horizontal zonation. So marine reptiles were deposited where they generally lived, and then whales where they generally live, and they don't live together for the flood, is how I would answer that. But it's quite unsatisfying to myself, and I'm sure the critics. But like I said, the order of the fossil record, how it was all laid down, I mean, these are challenges we still have. But I like to tell the critics we have the big picture still, and we're just working out the details. The big picture is the sedimentary rocks laid down over huge areas, one on top of another with little or no erosion. That's the big picture of the flood, with the sedimentary rocks themselves. The details within those sedimentary rocks that we're trying to explain. So
that's an important point. We got the bigger picture and we're working through the details, Mike, which is fun to do. If we had all the answers to the details, what would we do? Just be sitting here together, patting each other on the back, good job. We solved it. It's more fun working through these issues. So Sydney Raptor here says, where was all the sediment sitting around? What was moved by he says mythical flood, but I think you've shown, no, we got the big picture. The Genesis flood was the global Genesis flood. We got the worldwide evidence confirming that as we work through the details. Or do you claim that weathering occurred by supernatural super speeds? What are your thoughts, Mike?
Well, there's a lot of questions within that.
Yeah.
And I'm involved in this flood sediment research project, and we're trying to answer some of these questions of where the sediments are now, how they got there, what does it imply for the flood. We've determined based on the sediments along the continental margin, which can be 18 kilometers thick in spots like off the East Coast, that practically all of those were formed by flood runoff. So when you put that sediment back on the continents, you average 1,900 meters eroded. The top of the sediments at the peak of the flood were eroded. Now we're determining what's left on the continents. We're getting numbers about 1,800 meters. So if 1,900 meters was eroded off and there's 1,800 meters left, that means 3,700 meters had collected by the peak of the flood, which we place generally at day 150. So that's a huge amount of erosion. And the particles in the sedimentary rocks are more fine grains like sand, silts, even some clays. Clays can cause by volcanic ash. And so I made some progress on this just recently in the Geological Society of America bulletin. They published what they believe is the thickness of sediment eroded from the Canadian Shield in kilometers. And it ranged from 2 to 11 kilometers. It's based on the metamorphic grade on the surface, implying sediment over it heating up and creating the metamorphic rocks. There's some assumptions involved in that, but they're probably not far off because the Sudbury impact crater in southern Ontario, probably close to where you live, Donny, has been eroded 5 kilometers. It's an erosional remnant, so it's pretty solid, 5 kilometers. The Vredefort impact crater in South Africa has been eroded 11 kilometers. So what this is saying, we have a great unconformity, which is a challenge to secular scientists because it's a massive erosion surface. We had anywhere from a few kilometers to maybe 11 kilometers of sediment on the great unconformity that not only occurs over the Canadian Shield, which this article is about, but probably also on the great unconformity that occurs under the sediments in the United States. So the sediments came from sediments on the continent, which solved a question for me because I thought they might come from off the continent. And so you have the next question of how do you break up mountains? We're talking about probably high mountains implied in all this. How do you break this up and reshape it and deposit it an average of 3,700 meters over the continents by the peak of the flood? I believe meteorite impacts, which I have a lot of evidence for their existence, occurred during the flood, especially in the Precambrian, which I believe is part of the flood, Precambrian sedimentary rocks. These things would pulverize the sediments, break up mountains, and the turbulence and fast currents would erode the land down to a nearly flat surface called the great unconformity. And with all this sediment in the powerful currents still there, it would be reworked and deposited in other areas of North America. And so I think that's where the sediments came from. And that is probably your first question. So they weren't sitting around. They were actually part of the pre-flood terrain that got broken up by meteorite impacts, pulverized to fine particles, which we observe in the sedimentary rock. And I think 99% of particles are sand or smaller. And when you have a catastrophe and you break up rock, you have boulders and all kinds of sized particles. So you got to whittle that all down to small particles, and turbulence and fast currents and impacts would do it. And then it's redeposited over North America, especially in deep basins, starting out in deep basins and filling them up and then depositing over wide areas. So that's kind of a long answer for maybe the first part of that question of where was all this sediment sitting around. It was for part of the Precambrian ground. And then it was moved during the flood and reworked to be deposited where it is now, plus 1,900 more meters average that was eroded off. And as far as weathering, you don't see a lot of weathering of sediments. You do in places called duricrust would be one, paleosols would be another. And you can actually weather these by chemical reactions, acidic reactions. So what you call weathering could be done rapidly by different types of water during the flood. But most features, fossils, don't show a lot of weathering, implying rapid deposition. So that's kind of a long answer to that question. But we do have some reasonable answers to it right now.
No, that's a good answer. That's what we need for these questions and challenges, because again, we do want to give satisfying answers when we have them.
Yeah.
Howard F. He's a geologist in the chat. I've seen him on other programs, and so he has a few objections here.
Okay.
Does this contradict or challenge anything you said, Mike? He's saying our chat's moving along quick, so I'm trying to save these as quickly as I can. But he says not only is there erosion at many unconformities, but the erosional scours have the shapes of river valleys and are filled with river sediments.
Well, I dispute that. I think that's a paleoenvironmental deduction that probably depends on rounded rocks, and you can round rocks in the flood. There are a lot of unconformities. The great unconformity is the major one that's found on top of the upper crustal rocks.
Yeah.
And that is a great challenge to uniformitarian science, by the way. And by the way, in our flood sediments research project, we detected and mapped the unconformity under the sediments of the central United States. And we used oil wells and seismic data to do this. And in Kansas, that has a lot of oil wells, thousands we used, we were able to not only map the great unconformity, but we saw a lot of erosional remnants that were tall, up to 800 feet tall on this unconformity, kind of like Devil's Tower sticking up above northeast Wyoming. And if it was slow erosion for the great unconformity, you wouldn't have these tall towers there, because vertical faces erode much faster than horizontal surfaces. So under uniformitarianism, you shouldn't have erosional remnants on the great unconformity or on the surface of the earth today. And you have thousands of them on the surface of the earth because it was all formed by rapid erosion during the flood. So this great unconformity is one challenge. And then you have other unconformities, of course, where you had a lot of tectonics. And sometimes the tectonics fold up the rock, forming a dome, a fold. And currents are so strong, sometimes it just sheared off flat and forming an unconformity. Then you can deposit sediments on that horizontally on sedimentary rocks below that are at an angle, forming an angular unconformity. So with a lot of tectonics, you can form other unconformities during the flood. So unconformities really aren't a problem. We have a reasonable answers for not only unconformities, but also the great unconformity, which is dated anywhere from 1 billion to 1.5 billion years. And usually, a lot of times, Cambrian sediments, 500,000 million years are on top. So there's a lot of missing time in there in the secular. And they have to figure out how this great erosion occurred over this huge area. The flood can do it. The flood can cause, especially by meteorite impacts, huge turbulence, fast currents are scouring the land down to generally a flat surface with erosional remnants left behind. Because floods, when you analyze a flood, like a flash flood, erosional remnants are often left behind. It doesn't form, erode everything down to a flat surface. So let's see, did I answer that question? So I think often on these flat unconformities, you don't really see channels and river valleys. I mean, the flood can produce a narrow cut in a flat surface, by the way. In fact, much of the planation surfaces that were much once larger on the surface have been dissected by channelized flood currents and post-flood erosion.
That's a good response, Mike. There's a lot of interaction and debate in many ways going on in our live chat. And there's several comments on this. Paleosols. Howard
Excuse
F.
me, I got to plug in my computer. It says I don't have it plugged in. It says I'm running out of power.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, the day has been saved. Okay.
Yeah, there we go. That was close. That was close,
Yeah.
brother. I did hear that, that little ding there and wondered, okay, is that low
that's
battery?
what things are about.
Okay, so Howard F. He says there is lots of evidence of weathering in paleosols. Not just the paleosols exist, but the range of fossil soils matches the range of modern soils in different climates.
I don't think a deep analysis would show that. Paleosols are generally kind of what I've seen, like in the South Dakota Badlands, are just look like chemical effects on volcanic ash, which is what most of that Bad Hill sediments are. We have a lot of chemistry in the flood, and they can explain paleosols, but paleosols are quite different than what you see on modern soils. First of all, a soil profile is an A, organic horizon, a B, which is kind of a horizon formed by vertical movements of water, like clay layer or carbonate layer. And then you have the C layer, which is the parent material, or maybe a little weathered parent material. In a paleosol, you don't hardly have the A layer. You don't see the organic layer. You generally have a B layer, and it's if it's a carbonate layer, it doesn't mean it's a caliche like you find in modern soils. It could be just carbonate laid down by the flood. If it's a clay layer, it could be clay laid down during the flood, and the chemistry of the ocean of the floodwaters would change these features a bit. So they're different. Buried soils or paleosols are a fair amount different than modern soils. I had my friend Peter Kleberg in Great Falls and a soil scientist, Rick Bandy, have been analyzing paleosols for 25 years. I joined them in a few of these. Just recently, they came back from southeast Montana, where it's claimed to have numerous paleosols. They looked at a lot of them and found out that they're not even close to soils. In fact, they're having problems with the research grant because they're having trouble finding a real considered paleosols, even when they go to the location where it's supposed to be. So I think there's a lot of questions in this. And the idea of paleosols is a rather new element in geology. It's only been around maybe 30 or 35 years. It seems to be a popular fad among geologists to find these, especially in generally unconsolidated sediments or poorly consolidated sediments. So the ones I've seen have been very questionable. If you go through the Badlands of South Dakota, which is supposed to have dozens of paleosols, practically every layer is a paleosol, and there's a monograph on this. And if you look at the kiosks that they show you in South Dakota Badlands, you find a lot of fossils there. It's actually reworked volcanic ash by water. They show an environment of the animal, and it shows relief, streams, little hills. And there's a lot of these kiosks that are like this, showing all the animals based on the fossils you find in the sediments of the South Dakota Badlands. But when you look at the sedimentary rocks, which are poorly consolidated, they're flat over long distance. You don't see any paleo environments there, no relief. So, and all this is based on paleosols, and I'd say it's, what's the best word to say? I'd say it's questionable. But the most charitable thing I could say about it.
That's a really good answer, Mike. Like I say, you are an encyclopedia worth of information on this topic. And this is what we need, this kind of information out there to the body of Christ, because these are objections, these are challenges that are put forth by numerous anti-biblical creationists. So this is perfect.
I'm glad that some of them are here.
yeah, there we go. We got a whole list of them from Howard F., many of which we've discussed in the past. You just addressed the vast numbers of paleosols. That's a very interesting topic. I want to look more into that one. Coral reefs. Yes, I've heard that one many times.
Yeah.
Too many coral reefs to be accounted for in a global flood young earth creation model. Any thoughts on that, Mike?
Well, coral reefs, they're claimed in the sedimentary rocks as well as today. I just got through looking at Pettijohn's book on sedimentary rocks and on carbonates. He came across it. He said that practically all these so-called reefs are generally carbonate banks. And a lot of times they're not really coral organisms or other types of organisms, algae, sponges, stuff like this. And so the whole idea of buried reefs is questionable. And coral reefs today are not very deep and can form rapidly, we believe. There's a chapter in the book, Rock Solid Answers, that has an article on coral reefs that the reader can check. But I admit we still need more data on coral reefs. On limestones, we need more information on that too. Yeah, there is a vast number of paleosols, but it's only been around about 40 years. It's kind of a fad that suddenly popped up in geology, and there's a lot of them around in Montana and Wyoming and South Dakota, and I've seen these, and boy, I would question whether this is a true fossil soil, especially when they're missing the A horizon. It's just a B horizon. So why isn't it just a carbonate layer or a clay layer formed regularly by deposition in the flood? Excuse me. And he says there's a vast number of ancient river valleys. Are these in the strata? The strata generally don't show valleys, but we have a lot of valleys today and canyons on the surface of the earth, and these can form rapidly. When the floodwaters were running off, eroding so much sediments and sedimentary rocks, it first run off as wide currents, maybe 500 miles wide. And then as more mountains and plateaus extend up above the floodwaters are forced to channelize. And when they channelize, they got to accelerate because the same amount of water is now, instead of going over wide areas, now going over more narrow areas. So it's going to form valleys and canyons on the surface of the earth rapidly. So we have no problem with river valleys. As far as any ancient river valleys in the sediments, these are far and few between. There are some claims. Now, there's some claims in the Grand Canyon. You hardly ever see them, but what I've seen on these are just generally they're parabolic cuts in the top of a layer. They don't seem to be V-shaped valleys. And the flood can cause a scoop and scoop up part of the top of a sedimentary layer just laid down by eddies and faster flow in one part of a wide current than another. So we can form these features rapidly. And the lack of of isostatic response of the removal of all the sediments. Well, yeah, I'm sure there's isostatic, but you had non-isostatic tectonics going on too. So, and that's why the mountains on the continents, which many of them have marine fossils at the very top, like Mount Everest in limestone. All this tectonics is why we find them uplifted mountains from out of the floodwaters. So isostasy would be all part of this, as well as tectonics, maybe from heating of certain areas in the crust and mantle cause the uplift. Ollier and Payne in their book, The Origin of Mountains, had 21 mechanisms for the origin of mountains, but they said they can't prove a single one of them. But there's a lot of ways to cause vertical changes in the crust and for mountains, and then even deep valleys by sinking. So we can explain many of these. We have reasonable answers within the broader flood model. Okay, removal of all the sediments and more. Okay, well, the removal of the sediments during recession would be by fast currents moving offshore and depositing, forming the continental shelf. So that was a lot of questions, and I have some reasonable answers to some of them, but of course, we're doing research on many of these things for better answers.
You know, we had a comment come in earlier, Mike, saying it was a positive comment. They were saying how much they appreciate how relaxed you are. And so you address these challenges, in many ways, technical challenges, in a very relaxed, calm, collected, and informative manner. And I love that about you, brother.
Oh, thank you.
So let's give this one a plug. You mentioned it. Rock Solid Answers
yes.
is a rock solid book.
Reasonable answers to 14 geological questions by different creation scientists. I think John Whitmore did the one on reefs.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6.
Two chapters.
Do soils indicate long ages? But Chapter 6 is, do paleosols indicate long ages? So we were talking.
Klevberg and Bandy. Yeah.
Chapter 9 is ancient reefs, modern and ancient reefs.
Yeah.
So we've got some good answers there.
Yeah.
And what if somebody were to point to the chalk layers and ask how much biomass so old Earth Cretaceous, they'll say there's just not enough biomass for a young Earth Cretaceous to account for the amount of chalk, the sheer volume of chalk layers, hundreds of meters thick.
Yeah, I've heard that one many times. And, I think we have a reasonable answer. First of all, when you examine the data, you find there's a challenge to uniformitarianism, because a lot of it's too pure for being around for tens of millions of years. I mean, you should have a lot of other sediments mixed in there. So that is a major challenge. Like I said, when you look at something in detail, you find that it's a challenge to uniformitarianism also. It also has flint layers in it, like it's a form of chert or silicon dioxide that are in there. But it can be, I think it's about 300 meters thick in southern England, northeast France. The way I think about this is that these are from microorganisms called coccolithopores, and these are the calcium carbonate skeletons. By the way, I might add that chalk in other areas, like in western Kansas, is not coccoliths, but foraminifera. So chalk doesn't necessarily mean coccolithopores. And I believe during the flood, you had a lot of vertical currents, and you'd have a lot of mixing. And you have a lot of nutrients in the water. And in areas of, say, upwelling, you could bring nitrogen, phosphorus, even iron that they need, silica up to the surface. And you can have these monstrous blooms, is what I'm saying. And they can quickly fall to the ocean bottom, and then mass flow can collect this from a large area, put it into a smaller area, like in England and Northwest Europe, and collect it all, and almost pure, because it happened really rapidly. And that can happen because of all the vertical motion in the floodwaters. We have the same thing with diatomaceous earth. And in diatomaceous earth, it's a similar, but they're diatoms that collect. And of course, we observe all this very slow today. But in like the diatomaceous earth, we have some big animals in it, like whales in diatomite in Peru, and in West Central California in the Monterey Formation. Also, the chalk in western Kansas has big mosasaurs in it, and I think other large creatures, indicating again that this wasn't a slow rain of microorganisms, maybe at the present rate today of maybe a centimeter every 1,000 years, because these big organisms, the skeleton would totally decay in a very short time before you can collect much, indicating that these fine-grained sediments were formed rapidly. And like I said, I think deposited over a large area and concentrated in small areas. Just recently, satellite pictures showed that after that after that undersea eruption in Tonga that extended up into the atmosphere and stratosphere, that ash fell west of Tonga in an area of the ocean that was considered sterile because of its lack of nutrients. And this ash falling on the surface created a huge bloom of microorganisms really fast. So ash, and you had a lot of volcanic eruptions during the flood, and a lot of those eruptions would descend, start under the floodwaters and extend out into the atmosphere, spread. This would all cause huge blooms of organisms. And so just like from that eruption on Tonga, huge blooms of microorganisms during the flood can explain the fine skeletons of plankton that we find as chalk and diatomaceous earth. And the fact that we have large creatures in them indicates that it wasn't a fine rain over thousands, tens of thousands, millions of years. So we have good answers for that, for those challenges.
And that's a great answer. That's what I call, Mike, a clip-worthy moment, as we do like to make shorter clips of our longer videos answering these challenges. And that way, when people have questions, we have good videos that we can send them.
Good.
Okay, as we start to wind down, time always flies by with you, Mike. We could address these audience questions all day. You've done such a good job. They're still flying in, Mike. People look forward to having you on, brother. You're a fan favorite. I am kind of curious as to your thoughts on this. Howard F. is interacting in real time in many ways, and he's saying, with the large animals in chalk, commonly the top is disturbed, suggesting scavenging. You can also see this in Solenhofen.
Okay, that's probably that formation in Germany that has Archaeopteryx in it. But what is it? Okay, if you have a large animal and you're having a lot of chalk being deposited, and it plops in there into the chalk. I mean, if it was just 1 centimeter every 1,000 years, which is a typical rate of deposition in the oceans today, that organism, it might disturb some of the layers, but I don't really think that would matter much as far as this argument. It wouldn't be buried. It'd take maybe 20,000 years to bury the organisms, in which case the skeleton would totally disintegrate. So it's indicating that the point is that the chalk deposition in western Kansas and the diatomaceous earth in the Monterey Formation and in Peru, where you find a lot of big whales, had to be rapid. It had to be rapid deposition. And I think probably from mass flow, that if the blooms occurred over a wide area during the flood waters, rapidly deposited the coccoliths, almost pure. The mass flow picked them up and deposited them over a smaller area and a lot thicker. And in that process, a lot of big animals got trapped in there, so indicating that it wasn't slow processes of deposition. So I think I answered that question. So I think
you did. I think you did a good job. I have a lot of notes on topics that you discussed in your presentation. And so before we wrap up, I want to make sure to get a couple of these points in there to keep this as comprehensive as possible on the dating method side of things.
Okay.
And one piece of evidence that I find compelling that you presented on, Mike, is the helium diffusion.
Yes.
And the way I understand it from how you explained it is you have these zircon crystals, and you'll get a uranium to lead radioactive age of 1.5 billion years.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what you're producing from you're producing lead from uranium, but you're also producing helium as a byproduct of this.
Yes.
And so we look at the rate as to which helium leaks out of the crystal.
Yes.
And we get a leakage rate, which gives us an age. And from Dr. Russell Humphrey's paper on the topic, a really good age of somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years. So how do we explain this? Well, and I think you hinted at this, that since helium leakage is a well-known physical process, Mike, that helium leakage rate will be more reliable than the uranium to lead age that we're getting, 1.5 billion years. And so, okay, how can we explain this? Well, you have billions, well, 1.5 billion years worth of uranium to lead decay. But in order to retain all of that helium, the abundance of helium in these crystals, that must have occurred at an accelerated rate.
Yes, helium built up really fast. And for an age of 1.5 billion years, there's approximately 100,000 times as much helium that if those 1.5 billion years were real, that all should have leaked out and there should be very little helium left. The helium comes from alpha decay, which it goes through, like I said, 18 steps, but 8 of those steps are through elements that decay by alpha decay, giving off an alpha particle that grabs 2 electrons to become the helium atom. And it's moving around in the lattice of the zircon crystal, depending on the heat. Humphreys had this all graphed by the temperature. And so as it moves, as it gets too close to the edge of the zircon crystal, some of it will pop out. It's called diffusion. So it's a very solid result. I don't see how it can be refuted by skeptics.
Yeah, because that was going to be my next question to you is, are you aware of any explanation either within the creationist community or outside of the creationist community and the evolutionary community that can explain the presence of all this helium and zircon crystals that are supposed to be 1 billion plus years old, that should have all leaked out, is there any explanation that doesn't involve accelerated decay, or is accelerated decay essentially a necessary answer to what we see here, Mike?
I think it's a necessary answer. And
Okay.
there's been objections, which I don't remember now. I've read of several of them, but Humphreys has pleasantly answered them all.
Yeah, yes.
So I don't know if you've had him on this program or not, but he can go into a lot more detail than I can. I deal with a lot of subjects, and so
Right. Well,
I know the answers, and so, but if you ask me more details of what criticisms he's received, which I've read some of them, you'll have to get him on the program.
Well, Russell Humphreys, I was reading through a back and forth written debate he had with somebody from Reasons to Believe, and Dr. Humphreys did an excellent job engaging and refuting all of the challenges, all of the objections.
Yeah. He's pretty good at that.
Yeah.
And usually the objections are, what's the word I'm searching for? Not very scientific. I guess that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so here's my follow-up question, because this is always what the critics will say. So if accelerated decay is a necessary explanation of all the helium we find in zircon crystals, we could talk about other pieces of evidence too, like radio halos, for example, but let's stick with the helium. Accelerated decay, as we know, that's going to result in a lot of heat, a lot of energy. Accelerated decay of uranium to lead will result in a lot of radiation.
Yep.
Okay, so as creationists, if we resort to a supernatural explanation, then the critics just say, well, that means your model, the flood, is not scientific. So how would you engage that? Because there are some videos out there from critics, popular critics, Mike, and they say the second that we invoke anything supernatural to explain anything that we see, our model is no longer in the realm of science.
Well, that doesn't bother me too much. What I am looking for is the truth. And
Amen.
The way they define science is as strictly natural processes. So that's kind of a biased definition to start with. And when you talk about something that happened in the past, something that's exceedingly complex, for instance, like in the creation, by eliminating a creator, you have stacked the deck for your position.
Right.
And since I'm looking for the truth, I don't care whether they call it science or not. And it says in the Bible that God started the flood. God ended the flood when the waters ran off and the mountains rose, the valley sank down, Psalm 104, 6-9. And it says in Psalm 22 that God sat as king of the flood. In other words, he was in charge. He would keep the ark from getting hit by a meteorite or being underneath a volcano or in shallow waters during a tsunami. So God was involved in all this. And I believe he probably took care of the problem of the heat problem. John Baumgartner feels the same way. And I think it's a reasonable answer. But the way they define science, and therefore they say it's not science, it's kind of it's a stacked deck. So
right.
I don't really take any stock in that, since I'm looking for the truth and not whether it's science or not according to their definition. Sorry
Amen.
about you skeptics.
No apologies needed. God is Lord over all. He is Lord over the flood. And I've heard Dr. Snelling speak to this, and he said if the forces are changed, the rate of decay would change and be accelerated. You just have to have a change in the binding forces in the nucleus, basically.
Yes.
But if God is in control of everything, he could have allowed this to happen. We know heat drives geologic processes. And so if God would have turned up the dial, basically, and sped up radioactive decay, that heat and energy generated could have work to the fountains of the great deep break open, magma water shoots out, so I guess my question with that then, why would God accelerate decay? Do you think it's because it would have helped with a lot of what was taking place during the flood, or is it an unknown answer to a tough question? Mike, what would be your thoughts on that?
My first thought would be your last there. It's an unknown. You phrased it right. What did you say?
It's an unknown answer to a tough question. God's
right.
so above and beyond us that.
Yes, that's what I lean towards. We do have a lot of answers where God allowed the physical laws to just express themselves during the flood, but then so we got a natural, supernatural interactions in all this, and so we take it as far as what nature can do under a flood situation. We still have, and we have a lot of unknowns even in the flood. So we're sort of strapped about in this, but still we have reasonable answers within the flood model to many earth science challenges.
I know there are some creation scientists or creationists working to figure out a way to take a lot of that heat generated and put it into the core of the earth somehow. Maybe the earth's core was a lot cooler pre-flood. Now it's as hot as it is because some of that heat was taken there. I don't know how the heat's going to be taken down there. Maybe it'd have to be taken down there supernaturally. But do you have any initial preliminary thoughts on that idea, Mike?
No, it's just I think Humphreys tries to explain it by the expansion of the universe,
right,
taking in some of the heat. So I guess there's a couple ideas out there, but they're speculative. And
right.
At this point, I mean, I like the idea that God was in control and he took care of the heat problem. And that doesn't bother me because it says in the Bible that he started the flood, he was in control of it, and he's in charge, and he ended the flood. So, and he had a purpose for all this, and a purpose for the accelerated decay, which I really can't think of right now. But he's God, and he has the answers, and we're trying to think God's. What is it that word? Think God's thoughts after him, as Kepler said. Yeah, so yeah, that's where we're at as researchers.
Yeah, I think it's well said. I'm trying to think through how best to respond because there are other flood models. Of course, we have several different flood models, and there's at least one that would propose the idea that accelerated decay isn't necessary because it does result in all of the heat and radiation. But then my thoughts are, okay, well, how else would we explain the helium and zircon crystals? And so if accelerated decay is the best answer, but the result of that is heat and radiation, well, then the best answer could be that God supernaturally dealt with it. Or else, how do we deal with things like helium and zircon crystals and radio halos?
Yeah, radio halos is another thing. I generally did discuss that in my book, Deep Time Deception, because it's a difficult thing to understand by the layman. So I just stuck with the carbon-14 in diamonds and the helium, which are a lot easier for the layman to grasp. So, yeah, we have a lot of questions and a lot of research left to go.
So if someone were to have, let's say they were to propose an alternative answer to the helium and zircon crystals, because I have had some within the hydroplate theory camp, they've made other answers to that to avoid accelerated decay, but I don't know how to reiterate how they've explained that currently. But my thoughts are, because I've heard Dr. Andrew Snelling speak on fission tracks, would those who, let's say, reject accelerated decay, would they also have to deal with the fission tracks? Because I've heard Dr. Snelling explain it, where when you look at the bottom rocks in the Grand Canyon, where you've got 500 million years essentially worth of time, according to the secularist.
Yeah.
He'll also say you have equivalent to that. You have 500 million years of fission track formation. And so for us as creationists, we'd have to say that the evidence from fission tracks for 500 million years would have had to occur rapidly through accelerated decay.
Yeah.
Mike, does that make sense? Is fission tracks, is that basically another observation that suggests that processes were sped up?
I think so. I think I think there's very few creation scientists that don't accept accelerated radiometric decay, because it's so well established by the zircon crystals and halos, polonium and uranium halos, and also fission tracks, that it occurred. And so it has to be incorporated into a flood model. And maybe that, for a purpose, that was what was needed for a lot of tectonics and other features that occurred during the flood. A lot of things occurred during the flood. So
Right.
it's very, very complex. And so I would say that lost my train of thought.
Well, I think with what you're saying too, is it gives an elegant explanation, in my opinion, for the common challenge that you're so familiar with. The critics will say, well, why do the lower layers, why do they consistently date older than rocks on the top? But the way I understand it is, if accelerated decay is true, as evidenced by helium and zircons and radio halos and so on and so forth, you would have had more hits or rounds of accelerated decay earlier in the flood, as those earlier rocks were laid down.
Mm-hmm.
And then rocks later on in the flood were laid down, and there would have been fewer hits of accelerated decay. So you have older rocks. So all those rocks still in 1 year's time, but the rocks laid down first were experiencing more accelerated decay. Mike, would that more or less be the way to answer that question? Why do those lower rocks date older than rocks at the top, in rocks that we would say are laid down during the flood?
That would be my first guess. Yes.
Yeah. So that's an elegant answer with the with accelerated decay. So, okay, well, that's good, Mike. You've been very informative. We've still got a lively chat and enough questions to keep us busy until same time tomorrow, but we'll have to save some of those questions for the next time we are here together. Mike, I always enjoy our time together, brother. I like picking your brain with my own questions, and also giving you the opportunity to interact with our live audience. So, Mike, appreciate your time. I really enjoyed this. Let's hand it to you, just in case you had any final words, final thoughts, maybe something you wanted to leave myself and our audience with tonight. I hope the audience has seen this as a comprehensive examination of the age of the Earth, Mike.
Yeah, I'll leave you with one last thing. I keep up with about 50 earth science journals in the Montana State University Library. So I know about earth science challenges, and we have probably several hundred. I haven't really formally counted them. I've worked on many, and we have reasonable answers for many of them, but there's still a lot we don't. And the reason is because sometimes it's so complex we don't have a good answer yet. There's a lot of unknowns still in science. We don't have enough researchers to actually research all these earth science challenges. But we have the big picture that the flood causes sedimentary rocks. These challenges come from sedimentary rocks. We have reasonable answers for some of those challenges, and that gives me hope that we'll be able to answer other challenges, since the big picture shows the flood. So my hope is that with time, we'll be able to answer more challenges. And I would say this to the skeptic, that that we this is the status of flood geology, and that you need to bear with us that we can answer these, and the flood is therefore the flood is a real event, and we must take not only the history of the flood seriously, but also the spiritual messages about how to live here on earth and how to get to heaven, which you can summarize in Romans 10, 9, and 11, and John 3:16, where you have to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. And so that's what I leave with you, that keep seeking and have an open mind. But we have the big picture, and we have some answers, and hopefully we'll have more for you in the future.
Amen, Mike. That's the more important question. We can answer challenges and win arguments all day, but it's about what? It's about winning souls, giving people the gospel. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Anybody who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And that'll help people avoid the real heat problem, because we don't want that for people. We want people to come to salvation. And so excellent final words, Mike. This has been another very informative program. So I do want to give a shout out to some of your material here. Michael J. Oard, presentations on SFT. Anybody who's new to this channel or ministry, you can find at least a dozen other presentations and rigorous discussions in Q&A format that Mike and I have done together. Mike's articles here, creation.com. I've spent many, many hours going through those articles, that's for sure. Frozen in Time and the Missoula Flood Controversy and the Genesis Flood, books for you to check out. You also have a website, Mike, where you have a lot of free material there too. I know you got a lot of material.
Oards, OARDS, it has plural dot, is it .com? Yeah. And or .net, I can't remember, but I don't type it up. I hit a button and it comes up. I have 2 free ebooks. One is on geomorphology and the runoff of the floodwaters, forming all kinds of features that are very difficult, if not impossible, to explain by uniformitarianism. Then I have a book on the evidence for the post-flood boundary being high up in the geological column. They're on my website because they're so big that no one would publish them. So I made them free for your edification.
They could be turned into their own physical book, Flood Boundaries by Michael J. Oard. Mm-hmm. Where can people find your newest book on the Ice Age?
Creation.com. CMI published it. It's got to see how Noah's flood caused a single ice age. And then I got a layman book on ice cores that was just published in January. And the title is so long, I can't even remember. They changed it several times. So creation.com could get my latest 2 books, one on the Ice Age and one on ice cores. And I'm just finishing up a book on the origin of caves.
Oh, perfect. That's another one. That's another big one. So looking forward to that one. Here's your website, michael.ords.net. So they can get the free ebooks. You got a list of your presentations as well there that you give. And the last program we did together was on the Ice Age Simplified. For those in the audience, I see that come up on social media all the time, ice core dating. Old Earth Creationists like to look to that one. Yeah. And in our Q&A section of that program, we spent probably about an hour, Mike. You did a great job. We went through an article on ice cores from Reasons to Believe, put out by Hugh Ross. And so I haven't seen any good rebuttals or counters to that program. So that's good. You know, there's a challenge, ice core dating that you've dealt with. And so we can move on to other ones. Okay. Well, God bless you, Mike. Thank you very much for joining us. This was a great presentation. Definitely the kind of presentation you're going to want to watch a few times just to be able to absorb and digest all of this important information. We do want to give you in the audience the best possible arguments for young Earth creation and the Genesis flood and how to deal with challenges like dating methods. So please utilize this material when you're out having conversations and discussions with either fellow believers, babes in Christ, or the critics. So appreciate all the engagement in tonight's live chat. I really enjoyed it. We've had a ton of comments, ton of questions, ton of challenges come in. I do apologize if we did not get the opportunity to address yours, but we'll be doing plenty of more of these in the future. So thank you very much for tuning in. God bless you all. And Standing for Truth is signing out.